I'm Kathy with a C.
And I'm Kathy with a K.
And this is Killer Destinations. Today's destination is Manhattan, New York. Manhattan is one of the 5 boroughs that comprise the city of New York. It is the smallest of the boroughs, but it is also the most densely populated. Currently, 1.7 million people live in an area just under 23 square miles. Manhattan's iconic sites include the Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty, Times Square, and Broadway. It was also the site of the World Trade Center before being destroyed by terrorists on September 11th. As a result, it is a global center for finance, arts, and tourism. And while Manhattan is a much safer place to live today, the 1960s was marked by increasing crime and urban unrest, with violent crime in Manhattan increasing almost 200% over the decade. And in 1963, the vulnerability of the area was laid bare by the brutal murders of 2 young women just starting their adult lives.
Before we start, Kath and I just wanted to give you all a reminder that today's episode is a follow-up to last week's episode, which is number 220. In that episode, we talked about the prosecutor in the case asking his father for help. And his father, Thomas Kavanaugh, had been a highly respected and longtime member of the New York Police Department. He was actually, Kath, a lieutenant detective assigned to Manhattan's Homicide Division, and his colleagues called him the Velvet Whip because he had an ability to smoothly coax a confession out of a suspect. And one of Lieutenant Kavanaugh's cases, the one we're talking about today, resulted in a B on a TS. What's that stand for, Kath?
Based on a true story.
That was the inspiration for the 1970s TV show, and one of Kathy's favorites,
Kojak.
It was a hot and humid day on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in late August of 1963. A man named Max Wiley, who was a renowned radio advertising executive, novelist, and playwright, received a call from his daughter Janice's roommate, Patricia Tolles, who went by Trix. That's Trix. And Trix was in a state of panic. Trix had walked into the apartment she shared with Janice and another roommate, Emily, and Kath, as soon as she walked in, she just felt something was off. As Trix walked further into the apartment, she actually saw that it had been ransacked, so she turned right around, went out the door, and found a phone so that she could call Mr. Wiley. And the reason she called Janice's dad is because he was geographically the closest parent, and Trix wanted him to come over and make sure it was safe. He actually worked just a few minutes down the street.
So Mr. Wiley arrived with his wife Isabella and Trix stayed in the hallway while Mr. Wiley entered the apartment. Naturally, he saw the same things that Trix had, with the living room being in total disarray and things upended. So he walked toward the back bedroom door and then slowly nudged it open and walked in further. And Kath, the first thing he noticed was a huge red stain on the bed's white sheets. And then he walked around the bed and he saw something that no father should ever see. Janice and Emily were on the floor. He had to see the nude body of his 21-year-old lying dead. Next to her was 23-year-old Emily, who was clothed. But both young women were covered in blood with slash marks visible all over their bodies. And here's what's crazy, Kath. They had been bound by torn up bed sheets, but after each of them were tied individually, the killer used the longer length of bed sheets to tie the girls together. But of course, Mr. Wiley was immediately distraught, immediately panicked, and he ran out of the apartment, grabbed his wife, grabbed Trix, and they went down to the lobby where he frantically asked the doorman to call the police. According to a New York Daily News article the following day by Patrick Doyle and Sidney Klein, the 3 roommates, Janice, Emily, and Trix, were described as attractive young women who had just graduated from college and were trying to launch their careers. All three came from prestigious families, and in fact, Kat, the building they lived in was located in one of New York's most affluent and historic neighborhoods, and that fact is still true today.
They lived between Park Avenue and Madison Avenue.
Yeah, fancy.
Absolutely.
So Trix and Janice knew each other because their fathers became friends as undergraduates at the University of Pennsylvania, and their dads stayed friends and both moved to New York after graduation. So these two girls had grown up together. And Emily was from Minnesota, where her dad was a prominent surgeon. And Emily and Trix knew each other because they met and became friends when they went to Smith College together. So due to the elite status of the families and the girls involved and the sheer gruesomeness of the crime, the NYPD leadership, so like the chief, the squad commanders, etc., assigned all the highest ranking detectives to the case. And Detective Lieutenant Thomas Kavanaugh, the squad commander of the Manhattan Homicide Division and one of the very best detectives on the force, was the first one on the scene.
The first thing Lieutenant Kavanaugh did was sit down with the surviving roommate, Trix Tolles. Police had been called about 6:30 p.m., but Kathy, Trix sat on the couch and told and retold her story and answered questions until almost 2 a.m. Trix was employed as an editorial editor at Time magazine and had left the apartment that morning about 9 a.m. And so she told Lieutenant Kavanaugh that right as she was leaving, Janice came out of her bedroom and she'd clearly just woken up. And Janice told Trix it had been a late night, so she wasn't really sure if she was going to go to work that day. And Kathy, Janice was actually an editorial assistant at Newsweek. So fancy jobs.
Pretty studly.
Yeah. And the reason Kathy Janice had gotten out of bed was simply because she wanted to say goodbye to their roommate, Emily. And it wasn't goodbye, have a good day at work. The day she was killed, Emily was supposed to have moved out of the apartment they shared. Emily had taken a job as a teacher and was scheduled to start the following month, but she couldn't afford to live in this nice apartment on a teacher's salary. And so she'd been able to find a cheaper apartment in an area of Manhattan called Murray Hill, just a couple of miles away. So that morning, the morning that the murders occurred, Emily had actually borrowed a friend's car to start taking her belongings to the new place. So when Janice had gotten up, Emily told her, hey, you know what? You can go back to sleep for a little bit. I am going to take a carload. I'll be back in about an hour to finish packing up. Now, you know how we kind of laugh about how older newspapers, how they used to describe women?
Oh, for sure.
The newspaper described 21-year-old Janice as a lithe, slender, green-eyed girl of much charm.
They always gave physical descriptions of the women. Always.
I know.
Never the man, or rarely the man. Rarely.
Now, Trix, though, described her as someone who was always the life of the party and always had to be the center of attention. She was a lot of fun and wanted to be an actress. And because of her looks and vivacious personality, Janice went on a lot of dates and considered everyone she'd ever met to be a friend. Emily, on the other hand, was serious and quiet. She'd grown up in the exclusive Minneapolis suburb of Edina, and this was the first time she'd lived in a big city. Now, she didn't know a lot of people because, she only knew Trix through college, and she actually hadn't dated much, but had told the girls that she was really looking forward to meeting new people at her job once it started, because then she'd be able to have her own little community. Now, as opposed to the lithe, slender Janice, the newspaper said that Emily was plain looking, and then I'm not sure why an editor approved this, but they added, and some people even described her as less than plain.
Wow.
I know
they were critical of the fact that she wore glasses as well.
Yes. Yeah, God forbid. The other thing, Kathy, that's interesting to me as we were going through this, other podcasts who've covered this case or even like TV shows, a lot of them called their episode The Career Girl Murders because that's what they were called. That's what splashed on the headline the morning after these girls were killed. And it turned out, and it was just something that I watched later, in the 1960s, and this is the early 60s, career girl wasn't a compliment. You and I are thinking like, wow, they were ambitious. They were, taking care of themselves. They'd gone to college, whatnot. But I guess at the time, and, as generations change, it was right on that tipping point between when young women went from their dad's home to their husband's home and instead went from their dad's home to an apartment with their friends because they wanted to get out and see the world. They wanted to have their own jobs and make their own money and not be tied down. And so older society at the time didn't see this as a good thing. They were eschewing family values. And so the newspapers went along with that. And every time they wrote career girls, it was, oh, you know what? You're a career girl. You don't live with your dad or your husband.
This could happen to you.
Exactly.
Okay, so of course, Trix was devastated, and she was willing to help detectives in any way she could. So she looked around the apartment and told them that nothing of value seemed to have been taken. She didn't see any jewelry or watches that were gone, and their televisions, radios, and purses were still there. Now, this changed the detectives' initial theory because they initially surmised, okay, this is a burglary job. The house has been tossed. They're clearly looking for money and valuables. And in that process, they came across two women and they couldn't allow them to be witnesses. After Trix told detectives that she didn't see anything missing, they shifted their theory. They now believe that the apartment was ransacked to cover or mislead detectives into believing that burglary was a motive. There was broken glass in the bedroom, but detectives initially couldn't determine where it came from because none of the windows and mirrors were shattered, and there was no sign of forced entry into the apartment. And Trix said that when she came to the front door of the apartment, it was locked and she had to use her key to get in. But she said that the door leading from the kitchen to the service stairwell was slightly open. And so these, of course, are particularly in the fancier zip codes. They're separate entrances that are used by maintenance staff, delivery people, that kind of stuff. So the detectives believe the killer used the service stairwell as an escape route. So the murder weapons were easy to find in the search of the apartment. There were 3 kitchen knives, which Trix confirmed were theirs. 2 were in the bedroom, and a 3rd was in one of the bathrooms. And the killer made no effort to wipe off the blood on any of the knives. Because the crime was so violent and because the families were so prominent, the NYPD chief of police pulled 150 detectives from the various boroughs and ordered them to start pounding the pavement, knocking on doors, and rousting ne'er-do-wells.
And I'm actually the one who put that in because you can't read about all this stuff and not pick up on some of the lingo.
Exactly.
Kath, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Milton Helpern, did an autopsy, and in his report, he actually listed Janice and Emily's causes of death as multiple stab wounds and said that they had died after putting up a violent struggle. He was also able to identify the broken glass found near each of the girls in the bedroom. It came from 2 soda bottles. Each girl had been clubbed over the head with such force that the bottles broke. And Emily had been hit so hard that it fractured her skull. About 6 weeks later, the murders were still unsolved, and Newsweek, which employed Janice Wiley, offered a $10,000 reward for information resulting in the arrest of the killer. Kath, that $10,000 in today's money is $100,000.
That's a solid reward.
It'd be nice if they did that now.
I know, seriously. That is so freaking true.
So anyways, detectives continued to interview people across the city, but 2.5 months after the murders without any leads, Chief of Detectives Lawrence McKerney showed the knives used in the murders to news photographers for the very first time. I'm not sure why.
Kathy and I talked about this. I suspect it's because they were trying to keep the murder foremost in people's minds. You know, and they knew that, murder weapons are chilling things. People are going to pay attention.
But the reason it was also odd is that we also knew that those knives came out of the girl's kitchen.
Right.
It wasn't like he had one that was special.
They weren't looking for the killer's knife. Like who owned this knife? But I do think that's why I think it was actually just to
get it back on the front pages.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But it was a dramatic reveal because 2 of the knives had been snapped in half during the savage attack, and the 3rd knife we saw wasn't broken. And then Chief McKerney also displayed a clock radio that was taken from the bedroom where the young women were found. The face of the clock read 10:36 a.m., which was when the cord was yanked out of the wall during the struggle, and it gave the detectives their approximate time of death.
And that would be a very dramatic thing to show the news media.
Right.
Like here's the clock from the girl's bedroom.
Broken.
Marking the time of death.
Exactly. But as more months passed and no suspects were brought in, the outside detectives who had been brought into Manhattan to help with the case were reassigned back to their regular beats. And so the tough job of finding the perp now became the exclusive domain of the Manhattan Homicide Division, which, as we had said, was commanded by Lieutenant Thomas Cavanaugh. And Kathy, you know what I read about him that was interesting? He wasn't only police, he was also an attorney.
You told me that, and I thought it was fascinating because I could see somebody, becoming an attorney, maybe working for the DA's office and going like, you know what? I really want to be a detective.
His dad had been a sergeant in the police force and the NYPD for 39 years.
Oh, interesting.
So my guess is that's why he was doing that.
Right.
But by the time 3 months had elapsed after the murders, detectives had questioned 400 people. They reached out to police in virtually every state and Scotland Yard about anybody who committed knife crimes, evaluated more than 1,000 telephone calls, and took fingerprints of the girl's friends and acquaintances. And then after it was revealed that Janice had received some anonymous phone calls in the weeks leading up to her death, officers also checked what the newspaper said was known perverts. However, no solid leads emerged.
In April of 1964, 8 months after the barbaric murders of Janice Wiley and Emily Hoffert, New Yorkers awoke to headlines announcing the arrest of the killer. He was identified as 19-year-old George Whitmore. He was 5'5" and 140 pounds, so rather slight, and he was a black man living in Brooklyn who'd grown up about 150 miles south in Wildwood, New Jersey. And he had only lived in Brooklyn for a couple years, Kath, before his arrest. And so George was picked up by Brooklyn detectives for questioning regarding the attempted rape of a 21-year-old named Mrs. Elba Barrero. However, after 26 hours of intensive interrogation, George not only confessed to the attempted rape, he also confessed to the murder of a 46-year-old woman named Mrs. Minnie Edmonds that had occurred 10 days earlier. And he confessed to Janice and Emily's murders.
Wow, brought him in for one, got four.
Yeah, who knew?
Yeah.
Detectives said George provided them with information that only the killer would know. So now that they had their suspect in custody, Kath, Chief of Detectives McCurney disclosed for the first time that evidence showed that the killer had performed a perverse sexual act on Janice, but not Emily. Emily had not been sexually assaulted. So George Whitmore was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and given an attorney. So at his arraignment, George's attorney announced that he was retracting all of his admissions and he was saying they were coerced by police. And he actually did a motion to preclude the admissibility of the statements he had made. But the judge is like, nope, these were not coerced and they will be admissible. So he basically sent George back to jail and gave him no bail. So now that Emily and Janice's murders were solved and wrapped up in a big red bow, NYPD Chief of Detectives McCurney told the newspapers, "We've got the right guy, no question about it." And with the killer behind bars, there was a collective sigh of relief from a grateful public because, Kath, as you can imagine, the paranoia and stress brought on by knowing there was a killer on the loose who was, completely untethered and horrific, led women to become hyper-vigilant.
I'm sure their families did too.
I'm sure that was the case, but now everybody could relax a little bit.
Now, as we said earlier, Manhattan Lieutenant Kavanaugh was in charge of the investigation, but this arrest was made in Brooklyn. So Lieutenant Kavanaugh and some of his top detectives headed out to go speak with the suspect who was in jail at the Brooklyn precinct. So, Kathy, I came across this article in the Daily News. It was by William Federici and Kermit Yedeker. And this was crazy. When Manhattan detectives toddled on off to Brooklyn.
As detectives do.
When they got to the Brooklyn precinct, because of course they wanted to get details and interview George, high-ranking officials, that was in quotes, refused to let them into the precinct. Not one single man from Lieutenant Kavanaugh's detective squad or from the Manhattan precinct in general were allowed to interview George Whitmore.
I could see this being a total turf war.
Totally.
Like you Manhattan guys think you got it, but us from Brooklyn, we solved it,
We're the street guys.
Exactly.
You toddling off to your little penthouses.
Exactly.
But of course, this turf war did not sit well with Lieutenant Kavanaugh because remember, he was also an attorney. So he took his responsibilities as a truth seeker very seriously. Not to say that the other police did not. But, there is that extra degree that comes along with knowing the law. Backwards and forwards.
There's an extra responsibility.
Right. So after wrangling with the higher-ups at the Brooklyn precinct, Lieutenant Kavanaugh's squad was finally allowed to at least see the confession that George had written, but they were not allowed to speak directly with George. Now, understandably, the Manhattan detectives had come to know every detail about Janice and Emily's murders. They were the only ones who remained investigating after everybody was sent back to their own precincts. And Kathy, when they read George Whitmore's confession, they pointed out 15 glaring errors. One example was that George had admitted and detailed in his confession letter about the perverse sex act that had been committed. And he said he did it and wrote out what it was. And that had never been released to the press. But what George wrote wasn't actually the sex act that had been committed by the murderer. So, Kath, of course, the Manhattan Homicide Squad goes to the Brooklyn detectives and they're like, all these are wrong. And they're like, okay, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. So what Brooklyn detectives did, Kathy, when they typed up the confession so they could release it to the press, they deleted those 15 errors.
They're good to go.
Yep, exactly. Now, after reading the confession and seeing all of the errors, Lieutenant Kavanaugh did not think they had arrested the right person. And it was partly because of those errors, but there was another part to it as well. The Brooklyn detective who was claiming credit for making the arrest, his name was Detective Bulger, and he had originally been assigned to the case. Remember, we said they brought in detectives from all over the boroughs. He was originally there. But pretty quickly, higher-ups got a disturbing bit of news about Detective Bulger. And remember, they had been sent out to canvass neighborhoods. So Detective Bulger apparently had told one of the detectives he was with that if they knocked on the door and there was a black person came to the door, he would take care of it because he knew how to tell when they were lying. Detective Bulger had said, hey, you know what? Let's bring them out into the hallway. And Detective Bulger said, when I'm questioning them, you'll know if they're lying because their stomachs will move, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
None whatsoever.
But the detective he was with thankfully had the sense to go tell their higher ups, and Bulger was immediately taken off the case. So he sat out most of the time, and now he's finding the guy who did it. And so that was the other reason why Lieutenant Kavanaugh was like, you know what? This just isn't adding up right. But of course, the chief of detectives has already announced the case solved, right? Well, what Lieutenant Kavanaugh did, because Lieutenant Kavanaugh's detective team were in charge of the investigation, he found out that Detective Bulger had been kind of waving around this small black and white photo that they had found in George Whitmore's pocket when they arrested him. And the photo was of two smiling girls who were sitting on the hood of a car, one of them blonde, and Detective Bulger was 100% convinced that the blonde in that picture was Janice Wiley. And as the detective told everyone, snapshots had been stolen from the apartment after their murders. Therefore, this proved George had taken this from the apartment after he killed them.
And Kath, I read somewhere that the back of the picture had writing on it that was kind of illegible, but Bulger was saying that the words were George, Love, and Janice.
So now Lieutenant Kavanaugh gets a copy of the photo and looks at it, and there were two major things that were wrong with Detective Bulger's assertion that this was connected to the case. The first one was he didn't think the blonde girl in the photo looked like Janice. He was fairly certain it wasn't her. And the second thing was, because he knew the case backwards and forwards, he knew that no photos had been taken from the apartment after the murder. So Lieutenant Kavanaugh took the picture and went to the Wileys, Janice's parents' house, and said, is this blonde woman Janice? And they said, no. And he said, is the other person sitting with her a friend? And they're like, might be a friend, nobody we've ever seen. But unfortunately, it didn't eliminate the snapshot as possible evidence, of course, because the blonde girl and the other girl in the photo actually still could have been friends of Janice's. So they had more work to do. Now, the district attorney's office had made it clear that Lieutenant Kavanaugh's homicide squad had to find all the proof to back up the arrest made by Detective Bulger. They had to make the case for the district attorney's office. For Lieutenant Kavanaugh, of course, the first order of business, you interview all the friends and relatives of the girls to ask if they knew the people in the photos. Nobody recognized them. So then Lieutenant Kavanaugh actually said to detectives, you guys, look at the background of this photo, and I'm paraphrasing, as I want to do. Look at the background. This looks like a park. Go find this park, because if we find the park, we might find the girls. And so all of them split off, went to go look at parks and kind of figure out the topography and whatnot. And everybody came back and said, we didn't find a single park in New York that looks like this. So because they couldn't do it, they actually decided they were a little desperate and they reached out to U.S. park rangers and experts on topography. And they hit pay dirt with that. One of the people they reached out to opined that the backdrop of the photo reminded him of the area around Wildwood, New Jersey. When his detectives reported this back to Kavanaugh, he remembered that Wildwood was where George Whitmore was living before he moved to Brooklyn. They reached out to Wildwood police. They were able to identify the park as Belle Plaine State Park and told them it was frequently used as a picnic ground for kids from the nearby high school. So detectives went to the nearby high school, and a quick check of the high school, they were able to identify the blonde woman in the picture, and it was not Janice Wiley. So Detective Bulger had been mistaken. And so, Kathy, the challenge they ran into is that in the search for evidence against George that they'd been tasked with, everything they were finding would only aid his defense.
You know what I love about that part of the story, Kath, is just the whole old school detective work. Fanning people out across New York to find a similar park. And then you go to this, you happen to find an expert or somebody working for park rangers or whatever who's like, yeah, that reminds me of this area of New Jersey. Then you go to that area of New Jersey and you're at the park, and then somebody tells you, like, the cops, like, oh yeah, local kids hang out there. And then you go to the high school.
Yeah, and there's the high school they're from.
And then you find the people in the, that blows my mind. I love it. Nobody's driving 100 miles to parks.
No,
you know
they're not. Exactly. And Wildwood was 150 miles away.
I know. Detectives learned that the blonde in the photo was named Arlene, and she had gone to the local high school in Wildwood in 1958, which was 5 years before the murders took place. So by 1965, she was married with 2 children. So investigators find her, they go to her home, and they're like, hello, Arlene.
You don't know us, but we know you.
Exactly.
We've been looking for you.
Yeah. So she gets shown the picture, and she's like, oh, I remember this photo. It was taken right after prom, and I went to prom in 1958. So she tells them the name of the photographer. They asked her, hey, by the way, do you know anyone named George Whitmore? And they described him, and she's like, I know him, but I don't really know him. Like, I knew of him. She had worked as a dental receptionist at a clinic, and George had been a patient there. And when they asked her, by the way, he had this photo in his possession. How do you think he came to, have it? And she's like, I have no idea. You're going to have to ask the guy who took the picture. Detectives figured out that the boy who took the picture had moved to Baltimore after high school graduation, and they were able to find him, and he had become a lawyer.
We are lousy with lawyers in this thing, man.
No, but just this whole, like...
Yeah, because, they called the Baltimore police, and they were like, hey, we have this guy. Go find him for us and make sure he's there and, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, but just, I don't know. I love all the footwork. Anyway, this lawyer remembers taking the picture, and he said... Yeah, I used to live in Wildwood, but shortly before my family moved away, I threw away a bunch of stuff, and this photo was probably part of the stuff I threw away. So then the detectives were like, okay, well, where'd you dispose of this? And he goes, just in the garbage can in front of our house. So they go back to Wildwood, and they find that at that time, the garbage was taken to a dump next to a junkyard. The junkyard was owned by the accused killer's father.
Dun, dun, dun.
I know. So turns out when George Whitmore was initially arrested, he told the Brooklyn cops the truth about where he got this photo. He said, I found this in the junkyard owned by my dad, and I thought the girls in the photo were pretty, and I was going to tell people that the blonde was my girlfriend. That is so heartbreaking to me.
Well, it is. And you know what's even more heartbreaking about that, Kath, is George Whitmore had an IQ of 60. And he wasn't able to graduate 8th grade until he was 17 years old.
That is so tragic.
And so he's telling the police the truth with all of these things. I mean,
right.
What guy would want to admit, well, I'm just hoping to lie about my girlfriend so everyone thinks I have a pretty girlfriend.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to admit that.
And people, to be honest, people with a lower IQ have so much less guile.
Yes.
They tend to tell the truth, although they're very easily pressured.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. So it turns out this photo had no connection to Janice and Emily's murder. And the most damaging piece of evidence against George, aside from his reputed confession, had just been destroyed. So Kath, check this out. George's defense lawyers learned from an article in the New York Daily News that he was with a girl 150 miles away in Wildwood at around the time the murders took place. So can you imagine a defense attorney and you're reading this article like, what?
No kidding.
You know, I'm sure discovery rules were very different back then. If they were at all followed or existed. But anyway.
Or enforced.
Right, exactly. And the truth is, back then, investigative journalism truly was investigative journalism.
Right. And the Daily News was all over this story.
Oh,
and back then, remember, it was when like they had like 2, 3, 4, 12 issues a day.
Yeah, well, I don't remember, but I've heard that.
No, I mean, because of how when we've done the investigating.
No, exactly. Everyone had a morning edition. Everyone had an evening edition. And sometimes big newspapers had like, oh, here's a special edition.
Yeah, like extra.
Yeah,
here's more news. Here's more news. Wait, there'll be more news soon.
Exactly. Exactly. It wasn't a race to just get something published first.
Right.
You know, it was actual investigative journalism. Anyway, so his defense attorneys looked up the girl and she corroborated George's airtight alibi. So while George was off the hook for the murders of Janice and Emily, he remained in jail awaiting his trial for confessing to the attempted rape of one woman and the murder of another.
But of course, now that we know George Whitmore was not the killer, the investigation has to begin anew. But this time, Kath, they got a break that came from a very unlikely source. According to a New York Daily News article by Robert McDonald and Lester Abelman, a dope addict named Nathan Delaney, who went by Jimmy, was taken into custody on charges of fatally stabbing a drug dealer who had sold him diluted heroin. But Kathy, this arrest was different because Jimmy was a perpetual offender and he'd already been arrested for felonies 3 times and gone to prison. But in New York State at this time, a 4th felony meant he was looking at life. So as he's being taken to the jail by the detectives who arrested him, he says, it's too bad you didn't arrest the right guy. The one who killed the 2 girls. He's actually a guy you know. Like, you talked to him after the murders and you just let him go. And he said, but you know what? You take care of me and get these charges reduced, and I'll tell you who it was.
Jimmy's like, oh, wait, I know you're arresting me, but hold on. What's in my back pocket? Oh, it's an ace. I have an ace in my back pocket.
Oh, no, it's heroin. I think the ace is in the other pocket.
Exactly. Let me put that back in my left pocket and get what's out of my right pocket. Jimmy, whose real name is Nathan, whatever.
That's why I had to say that. He went by Jimmy.
His name was Nathan, but he goes by Jimmy.
Yeah. So the detectives took him straight to Lieutenant Kavanaugh. And of course, Kavanaugh knows everything about this. And so he sits Jimmy down and he's like, all right, spill. Tell me what you think you know. So Jimmy said the murderer was a guy named Ricky Robles. And Jimmy said the reason he knew it was Robles is because on the day of the murder, Jimmy was home with his wife, Margie, when Ricky was banging on their door saying, open up, I need a shot. I just killed 2 women. And I'm assuming he meant a shot of alcohol, not like a gun.
I'm assuming he meant a shot of heroin.
Oh, okay, yeah, probably.
Anyway, go ahead.
I'm still a little naive in the ways of heroin. But Jimmy said that when he opened the door, Robles was covered in blood. So, and this cracks me up. It said in the newspaper, Jimmy and his wife Margie invited Robles inside, although they didn't have any heroin to give him.
Again, rude.
I thought the 60s were full of manners. Come on.
Exactly. I have some iced tea and heroin. Which would you prefer?
So Robles told Jimmy and his wife he was just looking to steal enough money to buy some heroin. And he was taking the service stairwell, as we talked about. And when he got to the 3rd floor, which is where the girls lived, he noticed the door from their apartment to the service stairwell ajar. So he's like, okay, this is easy. He walked into the apartment very quietly. And the first room he got to was Janice's bedroom, and the door was open. She apparently had heard noises when Robles entered the apartment because he said she had a sheet in her hand, and as soon as she saw him, she covered herself in a sheet. But by then, he's already inside of her bedroom. And she fought against him as he attempted to rape her and committed this act of sexual perversion. Robles then told Jimmy that the other roommate, Emily, who'd been out of the apartment, as we know, taking her things to her new apartment, came home while Robles was attacking Janice. So he grabbed her as well. And Kath, Emily says to him, don't remove my glasses. I want to be able to identify you to police.
Clank, clank.
No kidding.
You go, Emily.
Of course, this made him angry. And so he throws her into the room with Janice. He beats them over the head with the soda bottles, knocking them out. And that's when he tied them up. But of course, he knew after what Emily had said, he couldn't leave any witnesses. So he went to the kitchen and grabbed the butcher knives and proceeded to stab and slash their unconscious bodies, which, thank goodness.
Thank God they were unconscious.
Yeah.
I'm really hoping he's telling the truth about that.
I am too. The knife attack was so severe that Janice was disemboweled and Emily was nearly decapitated.
And then poor Janice's father had to see that. So in late February 1965, this is a year and a half after Janice and Emily were killed, Ricky Robles was arrested for their murders.
Yay!
And this is awesome, Kath. Detectives went to the Bronx where he was working as a machinist and arrested him. Then they took him to his own home where there were 3 other high-ranking NYPD officers waiting. And of course, Lieutenant Kavanaugh was there. What was his nickname?
The Velvet Whip.
Kat, that reminds me, I had a client once and his first name was, Christopher. And he had at one point been a police detective in Northern California. And all of his colleagues called him Father Chris because he was assigned to child abuse, which meant he would have to interview pedophiles. And he totally had a penchant for making pedophiles confess to him.
What an awful job.
I know.
But thank goodness he was doing it.
Thank God. And he had this voice. It was just this very sort of gravelly voice of God kind of thing. And so, yeah, everyone called him Father Chris.
I like that.
Like, thank God people like that exist.
Exactly. And take the hard jobs.
Exactly. Anyway, so all these detectives showed Robles, who was shocked at the microphones that were hidden in his home. Then they took him to the home of Jimmy Delaney.
Did they have heroin yet?
They didn't have heroin yet. Poor Mrs. Delaney doesn't have any manners. And they talked with Robles about the murders. And Jimmy's apartment was also wiretapped. And the detectives showed him the 3 bugs that were in his friend's apartment. So it was totally like, the jig is up, buddy. We got you dead to rights. And so, Kath, what they did is they got a search warrant to do this, of course. Well, I shouldn't say of course. There's a lot of things that happened back then that weren't, of course.
But with Lieutenant Kavanaugh also being an attorney, I bet they did.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. Now that Kavanaugh is doing it, it's going to be as
Above
much on
board.
the up and exactly. Anyway, so once they show him the recording devices, he was like, ruh-roh. He left the apartment and was taken to the station for more questioning. So now detectives have predisposed him to the fact that he is done. Okay, we have you on conversation. You're screwed. Come to the station with us. So they book him for homicide. They try to interview him and he's like, nope. And then the officers say, do you want to make a phone call? Nope. Now that is a guy who's been in trouble with the law before.
Exactly.
Basically, they said, we just wiretapped you. Would you like to make a phone call? No.
It's not going to do any good, but would you like to? We've got to ask.
Yeah. So here's the crazy thing. Before they questioned him, which they thought he was going to talk, they thought they could manipulate a situation where he would talk. But before they did that, they took photos of his entire body, including nude photos, not for pornographic reasons, but to show that when he confessed 5 minutes from the photos being taken, he had no bruises on his body. They did nothing to physically interrogate him. And so Anyway, so apparently they did this back then in really important cases, just showing somebody wasn't given the quote unquote 3rd degree interrogation physically. Anyway, so it turned out Robles had been questioned in the weeks following Janice and Emily's murder, but he was not on the list of actual suspects. Why? Because mommy gave him an alibi.
Mommies really need to stop doing that.
Totally. Yeah, she was like, no, he was with me, and she lived 8 blocks from where the girls were murdered. He was with me the whole time. Don't worry about it. He's fine. Just 10 months later, Ricky Robles was tried and convicted for the murders of Janice and Emily and was sentenced to life in prison.
So, unfortunately, even though George Whitmore was cleared in the murders of Janice and Emily, his troubles weren't over yet because remember, he had still confessed to attempted rape and the murder of another woman. It actually turned out he was wrongfully incarcerated for almost 9 years.
That's so awful.
Before eventually being cleared of all charges. And as we said, remember, he had a low IQ.
I know.
And what's even worse about this, Kath, is that it came out, and this is why he was actually finally let free, that the woman who accused him of attempted rape, her sister-in-law came down to the station and said, you know how this woman told you that he did it? Okay, she actually knew that there was a $10,000 reward, which remember at the time was $100,000 in our dollars. She knew about the $10,000 reward and she wanted the money. It really wasn't him. And police were able to get this woman to admit that that was true.
That's disgusting.
Absolutely disgusting. I agree.
Disgusting. How do you look at yourself in the mirror in the morning?
So George never married, but was the father of 4 daughters and 2 sons. He died in 2012 in a nursing home of a heart attack when he was 68 years old. The actual killer, Ricky Robles, was released from prison in May of 2020 after being denied parole 17 times. And he was 77 years old. And as Kathy and I know in many states, life in prison doesn't mean life in prison.
Right.
George Whitmore's treatment after he was arrested helped change the way policing is done in the United States. In 1966, this is just 1 year after the real killer was identified, the Supreme Court made their famous ruling in Miranda versus Arizona. This is the case that established a set of protections for suspects. Of course, we know this as the Miranda warnings, and the Supremes, as I like to call them, cited George Whitmore's case as the most conspicuous example of police coercion and the need to better protect the rights of citizens. Now, interestingly, Kath, George's false confession helped convince the New York legislature in the mid-1960s to abolish the death penalty, except in cases where police officers were killed or prison guards were killed, or if the murders were committed while a prisoner was escaping jail. Because, of course, if George had been wrongly convicted, they would have killed an innocent man. And so this passed. But it's also why Ricky Robles didn't get the death penalty for the murders, because the death penalty was abolished just months before his trial. And as we said at the beginning, this case was the basis for the Be on a TS that led to Kojak.
All right. Thanks for listening. And we're looking forward to receiving some recommendations from you guys.
We are. And because this is just a couple days before Thanksgiving, we hope you all have a wonderful holiday.
A lovely Thanksgiving. You're going to fall asleep after eating turkey with all that L-tryptophan. Although I will be stuffing my face with stuffing. So I'm going to make a pecan pie and it's going to be delicious. And I'm going to make a cheesecake.
Ooh, what kind of cheesecake?
I haven't decided yet. I'm leaning toward Oreo cookie, but I'm not sure.
I support the chocolate.
I love Thanksgiving.